Hey everyone, how's it going? Hi everybody. How's it going, everyone? Hey everyone, good evening. How's it going? Good to see you all. Thank you for joining. Thanks for hopping in. I was on Twitter a couple minutes ago and someone was like, you should hop on live. And I was actually considering it earlier today because we're getting so many developments on coronavirus and on the census, and it's a big election night. So I figured I was planning earlier on hopping on live, and someone kind of reminded me of it. So I'm on and want to take some of your questions, want to talk about some things. So I'm happy to talk and field any questions that you have, whether it's coronavirus, whether it's any number of issues. I just want to kind of chat with you all right now and take it on. So if you'd like, either type in your questions here directly below or submit them here in the there's kind of a Q&A little section. So either or, I'll try to take some of your questions. Let me pull them up. I'm going to start with the Q&A section. And just browsing through some of your questions here. And again, there's some folks here, right here. So a lot of folks, let's see. Everyone here. Oh, okay. A lot of comments here on the election results tonight. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about it a little bit through. Someone says, tell us it'll be okay. Someone says, how do you feel about the primaries? What do you see happening in November? There's no sugarcoating it. Tonight's a tough night. Tonight's a tough night for the movement overall. Yes and no. Obviously tonight's a tough night electorally. If you are looking a little bit deeper beyond the polls in terms of what this means for the movement at large, I think that there's a lot of information that we have here that we can kind of glean from. Sorry, my hair's like falling all over the place today. One thing that's really important in these results, and this is something that I've been sensing a lot in my time here, is the generational divide in these results. Older voters, which we know are much more reliable voters, which turn out, have decisively gone to former Vice President Biden. And I say that, first of all, if you win a race, you win a race. And I congratulate Vice President Biden on the states that he won this evening. But if you want to look in and say, okay, what does this mean for the movement? One of the things that we're seeing is that there's a very strong generational divide. And this is something that I've encountered and something that I have noticed across many different issues. There's a generational divide in the Democratic Party on healthcare, on climate change, on foreign policy, on pretty much every policy imaginable. And as a younger person in this movement, I take a lot of that as information for how we navigate the next decade. So there's that. There's a really strong generational divide here. And what is surprising is how stark it actually is. We're not talking about a generational bump or a little bit of an edge. It is decisively different. And that is something that I think we need to read into. That's something that I think we need to be paying attention to. And I think as, in the short and midterm in the movement, first of all, I don't think it's appropriate to dismiss older voters. For me, first of all, we don't blame voters. That's not something that we do. We don't blame voters, we don't dismiss voters, and we don't think of people as disposable. No matter how old you are, no matter what state you live in, your vote matters, and it's something that we should fight for, and we should fight for every community and every vote. And so what this tells me is that from a movement, so there's like the electoral perspective and there's the movement perspective. And I think this is something that's really important that we talk about, because electoral politics can be movement based, but movements aren't necessarily electoral in nature either. And the interplay and the relationship between these two things is something to pay attention to and something that's important. So I think that when you look at the relationship between these things, and what we're seeing is that young people are overwhelming. From what I'm starting to see is that young people, and something that we know is that young people are overwhelmingly, our politics have overwhelmingly been shifted by movements. Whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's the movement for Medicare for All, whether it's a wide variety of movements. There's a lot of information that we're seeing here. And while people say, okay, well, it fell short tonight, young people don't vote, it doesn't matter, as I'm seeing here, it does matter for the time to come. People's politics, people get better at learning to vote over time. People get better at voting their values over time. But a lot of generations politically do get defined for quite some time. And it seems like our generation has a streak of progressivism in it that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. One thing that I am concerned about, overall, 100% legitimately, is in our climate. And I'm legitimately concerned about fossil fuels. I'm legitimately concerned about what this means for a just transition. I'm legitimately concerned about what this means for carbon emissions. And we're going to have to organize a lot. There are many, many issues where people's lives are on the line, whether it's pursuing decarceral policy, whether it's making sure that we have humanity at our border, whether it's, making sure that women have access to not just women, all people have access to reproductive health care. All of these things are life and death issues, but the scale and the feedback and the irreversible nature of climate change is something that I think we all need to really pay a lot of close attention to. And that's something that is really top of mind whenever I think about any election, particularly one as decisive as a presidential election. So, those are a lot of what we need to focus on, as always, as we have always needed to focus on, are the issues. And that's something that the good news that we have tonight is that that's one area where we are winning. Exit poll after exit poll after exit poll that we have shown in many, many states, the vast majority of Democratic voters believe in Medicare for All. They believe in healthcare as a right. They believe in decisive action on climate change. And I think that in the long term, what is important is that we are winning on the issues, and we are winning over people's, we're winning over people on the most substantive reasons for voting. Now, one thing that I think is different this year is that defeating Trump 100%, understandably, is top of mind, number one priority for virtually every voter that we have seen in quite some time. And so the notion of electability and ideas of what people think will defeat Donald Trump is, as we have known, have been very decisive in shaping this primary. I think it has manifested sometimes in unhealthy ways. People talk about the role of sexism in our election. And whether, if you take these policy commitments aside, I think there's something to be said for whether people find women electable, whether people find certain things electable, and whether people feel like they find a progressive agenda more electable. And that I think we are seeing that manifest in a unique way this cycle, more so because of the destruction and the unique threat that Donald Trump represents. So I think it's important to, even if you don't agree with it, even if these results even if you abhor these results, even if you are shocked and appalled and all of these things, it's really important to at least understand what is happening in front of you. And the better you can understand it, the more you can deconstruct it and then reverse engineer it and develop a plan to win over and over again. So I think that all of these things are really important to keep in mind. And the other thing to keep in mind is that if you are fighting for a progressive future, if you are fighting for everyday people, if you are fighting for working people, if you are fighting for healthcare as a right, there's a lot of folks out there that want you to be demoralized. There's a lot of folks out there that don't want you to vote. And it has been my opinion, and it will always be my opinion, that the number one enemy that anybody has, especially this movement and our movement has in politics, is cynicism. It's not any one person. It's not any one actor. It is how we show up every day. And I think it's important that if you're feeling sad, if you're feeling down, let yourself feel that way. But the number one rule in politics, my opinion, and in organizing in general, is to never, ever, ever, ever let your heart turn black. You can't do it. We cannot afford to do that. There are too many people's hearts who are on the line. And I think that even if you feel down about electoral organizing, that should never preclude you even from non-electoral organizing either, whether it's mutual aid or whether it's other forms of organizing. We can move in and out of spaces, but that doesn't mean you ever walk away. Or if you do walk away, or if you have walked away, the time is always right to come back. There's too much work to do. There are too many people's lives at risk. There are too many people incarcerated in this country. There are too many people who are living off of tipped wages. And I've been so scared all week for folks that are in the tipped wage industry, because I used to work in the tipped wage industry. And if overnight, all of a sudden, no people stop coming into your restaurant, let alone, we're not even talking about you getting laid off. Let alone, we're not even talking about people getting laid off. We're just talking about people who work off of tips, and all of a sudden, one day you show up to work and people aren't there, and you were counting. I know what it's like. I had friends that count on the U.S. Open coming to New York City every single month, because that's how they get their first, last, and security. And to live in a country that does not have paid sick leave, to live in a country that does not guarantee Medicare for all, to live in a country that does not have the housing security that we need right now, is to live in a country where we have to commit to doing a lot of work. And if we're not ready to commit to doing that work, then, we don't deserve that country, straight up. We have to work for it, and we have to earn it. And so, we have a lot of work to do, is what this really means. And we have to, so that's anyway, sorry, I'm thinking as I go. So on one hand, we have a lot of work to do. On the other hand, we have a lot of victories that we can claim. And I believe that we have won over the generational argument. I feel like we have won over enormous constituencies, both in the Democratic Party, but really in this country overall. And we've won over enormous, decisive arguments on many, many issues. And now I think is the time to leverage that. And now is the time to ask for accountability. And now is the time to ask for commitments, real commitments, not just gestures, but real commitments to actually confront the problems that we face. And I think that that's, one of the most critical parts. One is acknowledging the work that has to be done in very specific ways so that we can grow for the future. But two is also recognizing the power that we have right now. I mean, the power that we have right now that we haven't had historically. And both of those things are things that we need to do if we're going to carry this movement forward. So those are some thoughts that I have. And I'll take some more questions here. So I'm pulling them up on the Q&A. But again, the worst thing we can do is to allow cynicism to guide our actions. That has never worked. It only makes you smaller. And what you need to do is keep your eyes on the prize and at any given moment, figure out what actions we can take to make people's lives better. So anyways, I'm pulling up some questions here. And again, I'm taking questions on everything, whether it's coronavirus, census, etc. So let's see here. I don't see all of the questions, so I'm clicking on some of them, but I don't get to see, Instagram doesn't show me the end of the question, so I'm pulling this up. What are your response about NYC's response to closing schools? So this is a really important issue right now. New York City, there's a lot of school closures that we're starting to see at the university level and private school level. Right now, New York City closing public schools is an issue of, or rather a decision of last resort. And one reason for that is because of the fact that 1 in every 10 children in the New York City public school system is homeless, that even more children rely on public schools to get their 1 or 2 only meals of the day. And 3, because it also has huge, enormous impacts on parents that rely on going to work to provide for their children. And if their jobs do not accommodate for telecommuting, it can have enormous impacts on the city. So one, I would say, is that it's understandable why closing public schools would be an option of last resort. I do know that the city is actively working on plans to make and to ensure continuity of services for food. If in the event of a school closure, we are working on a plan to make sure that kids get fed. And this crisis and the coronavirus only goes to show, and I'll exit out, but this crisis and the coronavirus only goes to show how, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's climate change or whether it's any other systemic risk issue, it is always the most vulnerable people that experience some of the most dire consequences. And so I'll tell you what I've been thinking about. We made a list of some of the most vulnerable communities in our district and how we actually provide for them. So I think right now in any policy that we're considering, we should be thinking about some of the following communities. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list. There are more. But one, of course, we need to be looking at freelance workers, tipped workers, hourly wage workers, basically any non-yearly salaried employee that doesn't have telecommuting benefits, we're going to have to plan for. Two, the incarcerated. We have been sending out letters regarding MDC and Rikers because we are extraordinarily concerned that the plans to take care of people who are incarcerated are completely insufficient, and there's just a huge concern. MDC correctional facility had no soap or hand sanitizer available, and we're talking about tons of people in a crowded space, and meanwhile the state is using prison labor to make sanitizer. It's a disgrace. And so our first step that we're taking out is that we've sent out letters to figure out what those plans are, and then our second step is figuring out what we can do after that. The third, of course, is children, especially homeless, and these are not in priority list, of course. I'm just letting you all know who are the communities that we're thinking about. Children, especially, and just all people who are currently experiencing housing insecurity, or if they're homeless, aka it's not just if you're out on the street or in a shelter, but it's also, are you couch surfing right now? Are you staying with friends? Are you housing insecure in any way? That's going to be a huge issue. The disabled communities. One thing that I think is important to note about this moment is that so many of the accommodations that are happening right now have been demanded and asked for by the disabled community for a very, very, very long time. And there are a lot of people who deal with disabilities that have been asking about telecommuting accommodations, that have been asking about so many different accommodations, and they've been told up to this point that it's not possible. And now what we're seeing is a huge window for expanding the accessibility of so many different spaces. And I hope that knock on wood, we get this under control after this is over. We start listening to those disability advocates much, much more, and that we make a lot of those accessibility accommodations permanent. So that's one big area that I'm thinking of. Another, seniors and the elderly, and particularly in New York City and in our district, in our community, senior centers. Senior day centers are so incredibly important. We know in our district, whether you're in Parkchester, whether you're in Jackson Heights, whether you are in Throgs Neck, senior centers are incredibly important. It's not just where seniors get their meals, but socialization is an important part of all of our lives. And we're going to have to figure out how we navigate that, both in the short term and in the long term. So I know that there are folks, the other community that we're thinking about too is our immigrant populations, particularly with how the public charge rule has rolled out. A couple of weeks ago, the Trump administration rolled out this public charge rule that basically says if you rely on any sort of government aid, including Medicare and Medicaid aid, that will be considered and potentially put you on the track to be denied citizenship, to be denied residency, for deportation, etc. What that does is that it dissuades undocumented people from seeking health care. And guess who is the back of the restaurant industry, of the food industry, of so many other, of guess who, cleans hotels, etc. Many of those folks are our immigrant neighbors. And so to disincentivize our immigrant neighbors from seeking health care and create fear around it in the middle of a pandemic is wrong. And so this is just one reason why I believe that healthcare is a right for all people, because It's not just about, coronavirus doesn't care if you're documented or undocumented. And if you acquire that and you don't have access to the social safety net that that will keep you, that will prevent transmission and keep folks safe, then, what is the point? So anyways, those are some of the top of mind communities. I know that I'm leaving some off, so I apologize. It's by no means a prioritization issue or anything like that. I'm just kind of talking off the dome, and I'm trying to move on to the next question. So I'll move on to a couple more questions, and then we'll close out for the evening. Let's see. I'm putting people up, just looking at some of the questions, going through. Let's see. Sorry, y'all, I'm just going through some of your questions. Someone said, how do you see the role of local governments in the progressive movement? Local governments make up the entire bedrock of the progressive movement. Local governments are where progressive policies can be tested. It's where, when we look at everything from quote unquote economically progressive policies to social justice progressive policy. First of all, I don't even believe in that distinction, so I shouldn't even be talking in those terms. But let's talk. But to say, for example, Massachusetts passed a really sweeping healthcare policy before the ACA was even enacted. So many states passed gay marriage equality and LGBT marriage equality laws before, obviously, the federal government kind of found it, or rather the Supreme Court found it, to be upheld. And so I think local governments play some of the biggest roles in the progressive movement. Local governments have already passed Green New Deal ordinances. Local governments are meant to be laboratories for federal policy in a lot of different ways. And so I think local governments are really important. They're critically important. And also, frankly, I'm often very jealous of folks in local government, because they are the way that policy can get enacted the fastest. So that's something that I think is incredibly important. And if you're considering or have ever thought about running for city council or your PTA or state assembly, do it, because we need it everywhere. And that's really how progressivism wins in the long term. Let me see. Just moving forward. Sorry, guys. Let's see. Someone said, can you get into politics with a disability? You absolutely can get into politics with a disability. In fact, I would argue that you should get into politics if you have a disability. Our disabled community needs so much work needs so much more advocacy. And the best way to have that advocacy is to have someone that's on the front lines that has experienced all of these things. Just like some of the best people to work on housing issues are people who have experienced homelessness or housing instability. Some of the best people that can help guide and draft immigration policy are folks who have navigated that system. And of course, some of the best people to be writing and at the table in disability policy are people that have either experienced a disability or continue to experience a disability and understand what it's like to navigate these systems. So please, if you have a disability and you are interested in politics, and electoral politics, don't ever think that your disability is a reason that you should not get into it. If it's something that you truly want, and if it's something that you are, considering. But obviously we all make these decisions to ourselves, and you also have to decide what is best for you. So there's that. Let's see, taking a look at some of these other questions. Let's see. Looking at some of your questions, folks. I'll probably answer one or two more before heading off. Let's see. Thoughts on ranked choice voting or national primary day? I think all of these things are things that we can consider. I think that one thing that is really important, sorry y'all, I'm in my house, I wash my hands. I think one thing that should be considered moving forward is it's kind of the whole primary process is kind of strange when you look at the order of states. I think ranked choice is very interesting as well. Interesting thing to consider. We'll see. But I think there's something that to be said for the fact that so many states can happen in our primaries. So many primary elections can happen before we have a decisive weigh-in from our Black community and our Black electorate. I think that there's something to be said for the fact that the first two states just are not very diverse. I think that there's something to be said by the fact that a primary can be, that people can feel like a primary is decided before the vast majority of people have voted. California had a very fortunate move this year where their voice was heard on Super Tuesday. New York's primary has always been very, very late, and it's hard, I think, for a lot of voters who, if your state is later on in the process, to feel like your vote doesn't matter and that your voice doesn't matter. So I think that that's something to consider in this process. And also to know that these electorates are not a monolith. Just because folks from for example, we had a Latino turnout in Nevada. Latino voters in Nevada are not the same thing as Latino voters in New York or Florida or Arizona, etc. And sometimes I think that there's a lot of simplistic thinking that happens in the analysis of these primaries, that just because, this community in this state voted this way, it means that this community everywhere votes that way. We don't talk about white voters that way. We don't talk about women that way. And I think that we have a lot to go in terms of both how we talk about politics, but how we practice politics, but also, that also has ramifications for how our primary order is as well. So let me see. So I'm pulling up here. Let's see any more of your questions. I keep saying I'm going to take one or two more. let's see. Someone said, okay, just like kind of a housekeeping question. Where can I watch the whole live cast? So I go back and forth. Sometimes I post the live cast up for 24 hours. And other times I other times I just like take it down immediately after the live cast. I think there's just something to the ephemeral nature of it and just us having a conversation. It's like as close as you can have sometimes, having an intimate conversation on the internet if you just kind of take it down afterwards, because it forces us all to, I think, or at least it encourages us all to come together and tune in and to interact. So I don't know what I'm going to be doing today, if I'm going to take it down or not. But that's just kind of that. And let me see. I'm going to see if there's any more questions that you all have. I'm very self-conscious. I'm trying not to touch my face, but I know that I am. But I'm also in my house, so maybe y'all can cut me a break, but we'll see. Let's see. Sorry, y'all, I'm just looking at some of your questions. So this is something that is like kind of, let me see. This is something that comes up a lot. I see these, I've struggled as to like whether to address this directly or not. But, you know, people keep saying like, oh, like the future, like 2028, like blah, blah, blah. And I think what's really important is that we have a lot of work that we need to do right now. And I want to like level with all of you. I'm not a person that aspires to a position. I aspire to a mission. And we have a lot of issues in our country right now. And we need to address those issues, and we can't swing from one savior to another. And there's a lot of saviorism in politics, like who's next and who's gonna save us? And the answer is you. The answer is people. And I know it's really tempting to think that if you're going to vote for a person, they're going to solve all the problems, but it's not true. We solve our own problems. And what we do is that we elect partners in accountability, and we elect partners in positions, and we elect people that we think are actually going to listen to us and be accountable to us. But if you think democracy is a set it and forget it kind of thing, and if you think that if you just vote for X person now or X person next, that's not the mentality that is necessary for us to actually win on the real issues. Because why do we vote for any given person in an election, right? We vote for a person in an election. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons, but if you're progressive and you really care about a lot of issues, you vote for them based on whether you think they will work for you and the issues and the perspectives that you care about most. And I think that's really what we have to focus on. And, you know, I think that that's something that's incredibly important. We need to focus on changing and moving attitudes and shifting sentiment and developing appetite. And we are doing that. We're being successful. The exit polls are showing that people overwhelmingly are now supportive of Medicare for all. They have been overwhelmingly supportive of a Green New Deal and climate action. They've been overwhelmingly supportive of humane immigration policy and paths to citizenship. And that's what we really need to focus on, because ultimately, if you focus on overwhelming consensus and commitment to that, and you're able to get money out of politics, then there are a lot of people who can do good at being that work. So for a lot of people who say, like, what do I do right now? Support grassroots organizing that's happening in your district, that's issue-based. Support a lot of the projects that are happening, because there's a lot of people who are out there doing the work, who have been doing the work for a long time. And look at the work that's being done. And I think ultimately that's what's really important. So I think that's all for now. I really appreciate you all. Always appreciate you all. Obviously I'm in DC right now. We're conducting a lot of different votes. We did a coronavirus package last week, but I anticipate there to be more movement on other legislation this week or in the weeks to come. So anyways, I'll be here in DC this week for votes, and then next week we have district week. So one thing that I will say is that I have a town hall next week. Originally our town hall was on the census. We are expanding it for it to be a census town hall and a coronavirus update. But because of coronavirus, our town hall will now be a teletown hall. So for public health reasons, we will be conducting a teletown hall next week. The details and how to log on will be there. It will be translated into Spanish. We are working on having it closed captioned for folks that are hearing impaired or for any reason need closed captions. So we'll have translations, we'll have closed captions, and we will be providing updates. We will also be having a hearing this week with officials. So with all of that, please take care of yourselves. Please wash your hands very thoroughly. Please practice social distancing. There's one last thing on coronavirus. One of the things that people are saying is, it's not going to kill me. It's not about that. Coronavirus, there's an individual risk component, but more than that, there's a systemic risk component. So it's not about are you going to catch a disease that will be fatal to you? It's about if all of us get incredibly sick at the same time, our hospitals will be overwhelmed, our labor sector could be overwhelmed, our supply chains could be overwhelmed. And so the key is just to not get sick and to not be a vector, because let's say you're carrying coronavirus, you could be asymptomatic. If you shake someone's hand who is older, who is immunocompromised, who for any reason could experience coronavirus to a much more severe degree, to a degree where they could potentially be hospitalized, that in and of itself is the problem. And so you could be fine and still contribute to the problem. And if our hospitals get overwhelmed, if our elderly get overwhelmed, if our nursing homes get overwhelmed, it could be a huge crisis for a lot of people. So that's why we practice these things. It's not just about taking care of ourselves, it's about taking care of each other. So I encourage you, if you can, if you have plans, try to either, if you are a boss, try to allow your workers to telecommute. Please try to extend and advocate for paid sick leave. And even in the short term, if for any reason you are in a situation in the next week or two where you are where you have a service worker that is helping you, please consider tipping extra. If you order takeout, please consider ordering takeout from a honestly, it sounds almost so silly to say, but there's a lot of restaurants that are feeling the pain of racism, where people are literally not patroning Chinese restaurants. They're not patroning Asian restaurants because of just straight up racism around the coronavirus. So even in terms of what you can do, make sure, try to order, try to order local food, and make sure that you tip service workers extra, because this is incredibly important. So all of that is to say, thank you for tuning in. I so sincerely appreciate it. We'll be back in the district next week, and we'll see you then. Bye-bye.